blood rushing in his ears drowned out the station's roar. A woman with an apron stained by spilled espresso was kneeling on the filthy linoleum holding a sobbing child. She wasn't just speaking Italian. She was murmuring a Calabrian lullaby, the exact obscure dialect his mother used to sing before the fire took her. Lorenzo's knuckles went white against the wrought iron railing. He stopped breathing entirely, staring at the messy bun and the defensive slump of her shoulders. "Don't let her leave," he told Arthur, his voice devoid of warmth. "Find everything." Scalded milk spit from the steam wand, splattering across Gemma's knuckles. She didn't flinch. She just wiped the red mark on her skin against her dirty canvas apron, dumped the steaming pitcher into the sink, and slammed a new portafilter into the espresso machine. The morning rush at North Station smelled like wet wool, stale breath, and burnt sugar. Outside the glass kiosk, the concourse was a brutal tide of commuters, everyone moving with that aggressive blind stare unique to people who hated their jobs. Gemma hated her job too, but she hated the negative balance in her checking account more. Somewhere near the ticket machines, a high rhythmic wail cut through the low hum of rolling suitcases and train announcements. Gemma ignored it. She shoved a cardboard cup toward a guy in a suit who didn't look up from his phone, took his crumpled $5 bill, and shoved it into the register. The crying didn't stop. It wasn't the performative tantrum of a kid denied a candy bar. It was a jagged, breathless shrieking, the sound of absolute terror. She kept her head down. Not my problem. She wiped down the counter with a rag that smelled faintly of sour milk and bleach. Someone will grab the kid. Security is right there. But as she dumped the spent coffee pucks into the trash, she glanced through the smeared glass. A little boy, maybe 3 years old, stood by a concrete pillar. His face was blotchy snot running down his chin, his tiny fists clutching the hem of a muddy yellow raincoat. People were literally stepping over him. A woman in a trench coat brushed past, knocking the kid's shoulder. He stumbled and let out a sound that made Gemma's molars grind together. "Damn it," she muttered. She threw the wet rag onto the drip tray. "Hey, watch the front," she barked at her co-worker, a teenager who was currently staring blankly at the pastry case. Gemma pushed through the swinging half door of the kiosk. The air out here was colder, biting with the ozone from the tracks. She pushed past a commuter, catching an elbow to her ribs, and dropped to her knees, right on the scuffed, filthy floor, inches from the screaming child. Up close, the kid was shaking violently. He smelled like damp cotton and old juice. "Hey," Gemma said, keeping her voice flat. She didn't reach out. You never grabbed a panicked animal, and kids were just small, sticky animals. "Hey, look at me." The boy didn't look. He squeezed his eyes shut and screamed louder, hyperventilating his small chest, heaving in spasms. Gemma dragged a hand through her hair, dislodging a cheap hairpin. She was exhausted. Her arches were cramping in her cheap boots. She didn't know how to do this. She wasn't a mother. She was barely a functioning adult. But the kid was choking on his own breath, seconds away from passing out. Without thinking, she dug into the very back of her brain, past the overdue bills and the exhaustion, searching for the only thing that used to stop her own panic attacks when she was small, hiding in a closet from her father's shouting. She leaned in close, keeping her hands flat on her own thighs. "Stai tranquillo, passerotto," she whispered. The words tasted strange in her mouth, thick and dusty. It wasn't standard Italian. It was the heavy guttural dialect of the deep south, something her grandmother had dragged across the ocean and buried in the walls of a cramped apartment. The boy's breathing hitched. He opened one swollen, bloodshot eye. "Il lupo è nel bosco," Gemma continued, her voice dropping lower, finding a rhythmic, almost hypnotic cadence. "The wolf is in the woods, ma noi siamo qui, e la porta è chiusa. But we are here, and the door is locked." She didn't know why she remembered it. She didn't know why it worked. But the boy's shoulders dropped. He let out a long, shuddering sob and pitched forward, burying his sticky face into the chest of her work shirt. Gemma froze. Her hands hovered awkwardly in the air for a second before she slowly, rigidly wrapped her arms around the yellow raincoat. 40 feet above them on the mezzanine overlooking the main terminal, Lorenzo Vitti stood perfectly still. He had come to the station to oversee a simple envelope drop. It was mundane work, the kind of boring logistical garbage he usually handed off to a captain, but he hadn't slept in 3 days, and the sterile air of his penthouse was suffocating him. He was leaning against the brass railing, a cold cigar clamped between his teeth, watching the crowd with the detached boredom of a man who owned half the concrete they walked on. Then the sound drifted up through the acoustic vault of the ceiling. Lorenzo's hand, which had been resting casually near the lapel of his tailored coat, clamped onto the railing. The cigar dropped from his mouth, bouncing off his shoe and rolling onto the floor. Il lupo è nel bosco. He felt a physical blow to his sternum. It wasn't the language. Millions of people spoke Italian. It was the specific, ruined vowels, the harsh, gravelly cadence of a village that hadn't existed on a map since an earthquake, and a mob war tore it apart in the 90s. It was the exact phrase his mother used to whisper into his hair when the sirens wailed outside their window in Calabria. He leaned over the railing, his dark eyes snapping to the floor below. He saw her, a barista in a cheap uniform, her dark hair falling out of a messy knot, kneeling in the dirt holding a stranger's kid. Lorenzo didn't feel a romantic spark. He felt an intense, violent spike of paranoia. There were no ghosts. There were no coincidences. In his world, a coincidence was just a trap you hadn't figured out yet. "Arthur," Lorenzo said. His voice was a rasp, completely stripped of its usual smooth authority. The massive man standing 2 steps behind him stepped forward. "Boss." Lorenzo didn't point. He just stared at the top of the woman's head. "The girl by the pillar, with the kid. Put eyes on her. When she leaves, I want a shadow on her. I want to know where she sleeps, what she eats, and who taught her how to speak." "Done," Arthur murmured, already lifting a phone to his mouth. Lorenzo remained at the railing, his chest tight. The woman was just a smudge in the crowd, a nobody covered in coffee stains. But as she patted the child's back, still murmuring those impossible dead words, Lorenzo felt the familiar cold weight of his gun pressing against his ribs. He was going to tear her life apart until he found out why she was in his head. Panic usually had a smell, but right now, all Gemma could smell was cheap floral perfume. Leo. Oh my God, Leo. A woman in a tailored camel coat, shoved roughly past 2 commuters, her heels clicking frantically against the tile. She dropped to her knees beside Gemma, snatching the boy out of Gemma's arms with frantic, desperate strength. Gemma fell back onto her heels, her palms hitting the dirty floor to catch her balance. "Don't you ever walk away from me again," the mother shrieked, shaking the boy slightly before crushing him to her chest. She didn't look at Gemma. She didn't say thank you. She looked at Gemma's stained apron, her cheap boots, and the dark circles under her eyes, and her expression tightened with an ugly, instinctual judgment. She pulled her kid a few inches further away, as if Gemma's poverty might be contagious. Gemma's jaw tightened. The empathy that had cracked her chest open a minute ago instantly hardened back into familiar, cynical ice. "You're welcome," Gemma muttered, pushing herself up from the floor. Her knees popped. The dampness from the floor seeped through her jeans, chilling her skin. She turned her back on the reunion and walked into the kiosk. She didn't look back. She grabbed the bleach rag and started scrubbing the steam wand so hard the metal groaned. The headache she'd been holding off all morning finally sank its claws into her temples. 7 hours later, the station had hollowed out. The frantic rush hour had devolved into the slow, steady trickle of the night shift janitors, dragging heavy buffing machines, exhausted nurses, heading home, the occasional drunk stumbling toward the outbound trains. Gemma flipped the neon "closed" sign. She dumped the cash register drawer onto the counter, her fingers quickly sorting the dirty, crumpled bills. $84 in tips. It was pathetic, but it would buy groceries. She shoved the cash into her worn leather purse, grabbed her heavy coat, and locked the rolling metal grate of the kiosk. The loud clack of the padlock echoed in the empty concourse. As she turned toward the main exit, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was a subtle shift in the air, a change in the atmospheric pressure of the room. Gemma had grown up in neighborhoods where ignoring that feeling meant getting a busted lip or worse. She kept her pace steady, her eyes fixed on the glass doors ahead, but she let her peripheral vision sweep the edges of the terminal. To her right, near the shuttered magazine stand, a man was pretending to read a train schedule. He was big, too big to be a commuter, and his suit, even from 30 feet away, hung with the precise heavy drape of custom tailoring. Cops wore cheap suits that bunched at the shoulders. This guy looked like money and violence. Gemma swallowed hard. Is it Marcus Snow? She hadn't spoken to her ex in 2 years. He didn't have the cash to hire muscle like that. Did the landlord sell my debt? She pushed through the heavy glass doors and hit the street. The Chicago wind immediately bit into her cheeks, carrying the sharp scent of exhaust fumes and freezing rain. She pulled her collar up, buried her chin in the cheap wool, and started walking east towards the L train. She listened. Over the rumble of traffic and the hiss of tires on wet pavement, she heard it. Click, clack, hard-soled shoes, expensive leather, matching her pace exactly. Gemma's heart shoved against her ribs. She didn't speed up. If you run, they chase. She kept her head down, weaving through a small group of tourists outside a steakhouse, using their bodies to break the line of sight for 3 seconds. She ducked into a narrow, brightly lit bodega on the corner. She walked straight to the back, pretending to examine a row of dusty canned soups. She pulled out her phone, holding it at an angle so the black screen caught the reflection of the bodega's front window. The man in the suit didn't come in. He stood across the street, lighting a cigarette, completely unfazed. He wasn't trying to grab her. He was tracking her. Gemma's hands shook. She gripped a cold can of chicken noodle until her knuckles ached. She had nothing worth stealing and knew nothing worth killing for. 3 blocks away, idling in an alley behind the station, Lorenzo sat in the cavernous back seat of a black Maybach. The air inside smelled of expensive leather and the faint metallic tang of the gun resting on the seat beside him. The tinted window rolled down an inch. The freezing air rushed in. The passenger door opened, and Arthur slid into the front seat, passing a slim tablet into the back. Gemma Hayes. Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. 26. No criminal record. Credit score is garbage. Works the coffee stand, rents a studio above a defunct dry cleaner in Pilsen. Parents deceased. She's a ghost in the system, boss. Completely unremarkable. Lorenzo stared at the illuminated screen. The DMV photo showed a girl with tired eyes, her chin tipped up in a defensive tilt. Unremarkable. Lorenzo repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He swiped through the meager file. Bank statements, a lease agreement, utility bills. Nothing suggested ties to the Calabrian underworld. Nothing suggested she belonged in the crosshairs of the outfit. She went into a bodega, Arthur noted, looking at a message on his own phone. Paul is on her. She knows she's being followed. She's got street sense. Pull Paul back, Lorenzo said softly. Arthur turned in his seat, surprised. Pull him back. You wanted her watched. If she knows he's there, she'll bolt, or she'll do something stupid, Lorenzo said, locking the tablet screen. The image of her tired face vanished, plunging the back seat into darkness. I don't want her scared of a shadow. Lorenzo picked up his gun, checking the safety out of pure habit before sliding it into his shoulder holster. The dull ache in his chest, the one that had started the moment he heard that lullaby, was hardening into a cold, sharp obsession. "I'll handle her myself," Lorenzo said, staring out at the rain-slicked brick wall of the alley. "Find out what time her shift starts tomorrow. I'm getting coffee." Bleach couldn't mask the smell of old milk. It was baked into the grout of the kiosk. Gemma scrubbed the counter until her knuckles ached, keeping her head down as the 5:30 a.m. commuter wave began to swell. Her muscles felt bruised. She had slept for maybe 2 hours, her brain looping the image of the man in the custom suit standing under the street lamp. She dumped a bag of dark roast beans into the hopper. The loud, grinding crunch briefly drowned out the station announcements. When she turned around, he was there. He didn't walk up like a normal customer, looking at the pastry case or fumbling for a wallet. He was just suddenly occupying the space at the register. Gemma's hand froze on the edge of the plastic beanbag. It wasn't the man from the street. This man was leaner, taller, and completely still. He wore a dark wool overcoat that probably cost more than her yearly rent. But it wasn't the clothes that made her stomach drop. It was his stillness. Commuters fidgeted. They checked watches, shifted their weight, tapped their cards. This man stood with the terrifying relaxed posture of a predator that had already secured all the exits. "Double espresso," he said. His voice was a low rasp. It didn't boom, but it carried perfectly over the noise of the concourse. Gemma swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "For here or to go?" "Here." She punched the order into the screen. $4.50. He didn't hand her cash. He slid a matte black card across the scratched aluminum counter. Gemma took it, being careful not to let her fingers brush his. His hands were large, the knuckles rough, a heavy gold signet ring catching the harsh fluorescent light. She ran the card, handed it back, and turned to the machine. She needed the physical routine. Purge the steam wand, grind the beans, tamp the grounds, 30 pounds of pressure. Lock the portafilter. Press the button. The hiss of the boiling water grounded her. Behind her, the silence was heavy. She could feel him watching. It wasn't the sleazy, wandering gaze of the finance guys who worked in the loop. It was analytical. He was dismantling her. "You handled that kid well yesterday," the man said. Gemma's hand jerked. A drop of boiling espresso splashed onto the metal grate. She didn't turn around. "Just trying to keep the noise down." She lied, her voice flat. "Kids scream, it's bad for business." "You spoke to him in Italian." She grabbed a small ceramic cup, poured the thick, dark shot into it, and set it on the counter between them. She kept her eyes on the cup, avoiding his face. "I speak a little. Heard it from my neighbors growing up." "Is that right?" It wasn't a question. Lorenzo picked up the cup. The heat of the ceramic seeped into his cold fingers, but he barely registered it. He was close enough now to smell her. Cheap vanilla soap and the bitter tang of roasted coffee. Up close, the exhaustion on her face was stark. She had dark, bruised shadows under her eyes, and a small white scar interrupted the line of her left eyebrow. She was lying. He had spent the entire night tearing apart the meager digital footprint of Gemma Hayes. She grew up in foster care in Ohio, bounced around group homes until she aged out. No Italian neighbors. No European travel. Her birth certificate was a delayed filing issued when she was 7 years old. Before that, she didn't exist. He took a slow sip of the espresso. It was bitter, over-extracted. He didn't care. "There's a specific phrase you used," Lorenzo said, keeping his tone conversational casual. "Il lupo è nel bosco." Gemma's breath caught. It was a microscopic physical reaction, but Lorenzo caught it. Her pupils dilated, the muscles in her jaw locked tight. "It means the wolf is in the woods," she said tightly, grabbing a wet rag and wiping down a section of the counter that was already clean. "It's a fairy tale." "It's a warning," Lorenzo corrected softly. He leaned forward, resting one forearm on the counter. The ambient noise of the train station seemed to fade, sucked into the vacuum of the space between them. "A fairy tale tells you the wolf is scary," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. "A warning tells you to lock the door, because the wolf is already hunting. The dialect you used, it's a dead language, Gemma, from a town that burned to the ground 30 years ago. So I'll ask you again, who taught you that song?" Gemma stopped wiping the counter. The rag dripped dirty water onto her boots. Her heart was hammering a frantic, violent rhythm against her ribs. He knew her name. She wasn't wearing a name tag. She looked up, finally meeting his eyes. They were pitch black, entirely devoid of warmth or empathy. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said. Her voice shook just once, betraying her. "And if you don't step back from my counter, I'm hitting the panic button." Lorenzo stared at her for 3 long seconds. He didn't blink. Then slowly he straightened up. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and laid it next to his half-empty cup. "Keep the change," he said. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of grey winter coats. Gemma gripped the edge of the counter until her fingers went numb, trying to pull air into her burning lungs. Rain lashed against the rattling windows of the L train. Gemma sat rigid in the molded plastic seat, staring blankly at the dark tunnels rushing past. The train car smelled of wet dog and cheap marijuana. "He knows your name." She chewed the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper. The foster system had taught her one ironclad rule: when adults started asking specific questions, you packed your bags. You never waited to find out why. She got off at the 18th Street station. The wind off Lake Michigan whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She pulled her thin coat tighter and power-walked down the cracked sidewalk. Pilsen was quiet tonight. The neon sign of the taqueria on the corner was burned out, plunging her block into heavy shadows. She lived above an abandoned dry cleaner. The front door to the stairwell was heavy steel, painted a peeling industrial grey. She dug her keys out of her pocket, her fingers clumsy with the cold. As she shoved the key into the deadbolt, a sound stopped her. The soft, unmistakable scrape of a leather sole on wet concrete. Behind her, Gemma didn't scream. Screaming in this neighborhood was just background noise. She ripped the key out of the lock, spun around, and drove her fist blindly toward the shadow, stepping out from the recessed doorway of the dry cleaner. A large hand caught her wrist mid-air. The grip was like an iron vice. "Easy," a deep voice rumbled. It was the big man from yesterday, the shadow in the expensive suit. He didn't twist her arm or hurt her. He just held her wrist suspended in the freezing air, easily absorbing her desperate momentum. "Let go of me," she hissed, kicking out with her heavy work boot. He easily sidestepped the kick. "I am not here to hurt you, but I am not letting you run." "Arthur," the second voice cut through the rain, cold, authoritative, from the dark interior of a black town car. Idling at the curb, Lorenzo stepped out. He didn't bother with an umbrella. The rain immediately soaked the shoulders of his dark coat. He walked slowly across the wet pavement, his hands resting casually in his pockets. "Let her go," Lorenzo commanded. Arthur released her wrist immediately and stepped back, melting into the shadows by the brick wall. Gemma stumbled backward, her spine hitting the cold steel of her door. Her chest heaved. She recognized the dynamic instantly. The big guy was the muscle. The quiet guy was the executioner. You have 3 seconds to get back in that car before I start screaming, 'Fire!'" Gemma breathed, her voice trembling with adrenaline and rage. "I don't have money. I don't owe anybody money. You have the wrong person." "You were a ward of the state in Cleveland," Lorenzo said, ignoring her threat entirely. He stopped 3 feet away from her. The street lamp cast harsh shadows across his face, emphasizing the sharp, cruel line of his jaw. "Found wandering a truck stop off I-80 in a dirty nightgown. You couldn't speak a word of English. You only spoke an obscure Italian dialect. They gave you the name Gemma because you were clutching a cheap plastic gemstone in your fist." Gemma felt the blood drain from her face. Her knees went weak. She pressed her palms flat against the wet door behind her just to stay upright. Nobody knew that. The Foster records were sealed. She had spent a decade burying that terrified, mute little girl under layers of sarcasm, cheap coffee, and survival instincts. "How did you get my file?" she whispered, the fight suddenly leaking out of her. "I bought the people who had your file," Lorenzo said plainly. It wasn't a boast. It was a simple statement of fact. "There is no record of your birth. There is no missing child report matching your description. You just appeared in the dirt, speaking the language of ghosts." "I don't know who I am," she said, her voice cracking. The rain plastered her dark hair to her cheeks. She was shivering violently now, the cold biting deep into her bones. "I don't remember anything before the truck stop, just fire. And the song. The song used to play in my head when I was scared." Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. A dangerous, jagged fraction of an inch. "My mother sang that song," Lorenzo said softly. The words sounded like they cost him something heavy. "She sang it to me in a cellar in Calabria, while our rivals burned our estate to the ground. She died in that fire. Everyone died in that fire." Gemma stared at him. The smell of exhaust fumes and wet asphalt seemed to vanish, replaced by a phantom scent. Ash, burning timber, melting plastic. Her stomach violently turned. "I don't know you," she breathed, shaking her head. "I don't know her." "I know," Lorenzo said. He took 1 step closer, invading her space. His body heat radiated against the freezing air. He looked down at her, studying the defiant, terrified tilt of her chin. "But you carry her ghost in your throat, and until I figure out why you belong to me." He didn't wait for her to argue. He turned to Arthur. "Pack her things. We're leaving." "No." The word punched out of Gemma's chest, sharp and entirely instinctual. She slammed her hand flat against the peeling steel of the door, physically blocking Arthur as he moved forward. Her fingers were numb from the cold, her wet hair plastered to her skull, but her jaw was locked. "He doesn't go in my apartment," she said, staring directly at Lorenzo. She didn't raise her voice. Screaming on a dark street in Pilsen wouldn't bring help. It would just make people turn off their lights. "If you're taking me, I pack my own bag. Nobody touches my things." Lorenzo studied her. The rain was running down the sharp angles of his face, soaking into the collar of his expensive coat. But he didn't seem to feel it. He watched the tremor in her chin, the desperate, territorial flattening of her hand against the door. 2 minutes, Lorenzo said. "Arthur goes with you. He stays in the doorway. You try for a fire escape, he'll break both your legs and carry you down the stairs." "Understood." Gemma swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She gave a single jerky nod. She turned the key, shoved the door open, and took the stairs 2 at a time. Her apartment was a single cramped room over the defunct dry cleaner. It smelled of damp brick, cheap lavender soap, and the lingering odor of the hot plate she used to boil pasta. Arthur filled the doorway, his massive frame blocking out the dim light from the stairwell. He didn't speak. He just watched. Gemma moved with frantic, practiced efficiency. Foster care had taught her how to pack a life into a single bag in under 60 seconds. She dragged a faded canvas duffel from under her mattress, jeans, work shirts, underwear. She grabbed her toothbrush from the tiny rust-stained sink. From the back of the freezer, she pulled out a frozen box of baking soda, dug her freezing fingers into the powder, and extracted a rolled-up wad of cash. $312. Her emergency fund. She shoved it into her boot. When she turned back, Arthur was still watching her, his face an unreadable mask. "Time," he rumbled. Gemma zipped the duffel. She didn't look back at the room. There was nothing to miss. Downstairs, the back door of the black Maybach was open. Lorenzo was already inside. Gemma hesitated on the curb, the rain soaking through her thin coat, chilling her to the bone. This was the threshold. Getting into a car with strange men was the universal rule of things you never came back from. But she looked down the empty, flooded street, and then at Arthur's massive hands. She had no leverage. None. She ducked her head and slid into the cavernous back seat. Arthur shut the door. The heavy thud severed them from the outside world. The soundproofing in the car was absolute. The howling wind and the drumming rain vanished, replaced by an oppressive heavy silence. The air inside smelled of bergamot, expensive leather, and the faint metallic scent of gun oil. Lorenzo sat on the opposite side, staring out the tinted window. He didn't look at her as the car pulled away from the curb, its massive engine emitting a barely perceptible hum. Gemma sat rigidly in the center of her seat, her wet clothes clinging to her shivering skin. Her teeth began to chatter, a loud clicking sound in the quiet cabin. She clamped her jaw shut, her muscles trembling with the effort to suppress the physical reaction to the freezing rain and the adrenaline crash. A soft click echoed near Lorenzo's hand. A second later, a wave of heat radiated from beneath the leather seat, seeping into Gemma's damp jeans. "Take off the coat," Lorenzo said. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that filled the enclosed space. "I'm fine," she lied through her teeth. Lorenzo finally turned his head. His dark eyes caught the amber glow of the passing streetlights. "I didn't turn the heat on to be hospitable. You're shaking so hard it's distracting. Take the wet coat off, Gemma, or I will have Arthur pull over and take it off for you." The threat was delivered with the casual, flat tone of a man discussing the weather. Gemma's hands fumbled with the cheap plastic buttons of her coat. Her knuckles were stark white. She shrugged out of the soaked wool and bunched it onto the floorboard, pulling her knees tight together. The heat from the seat began to thaw her skin, but the cold knot in her stomach remained untouched. "You're a liability," Lorenzo said quietly, his gaze dropping to her trembling hands. "My organization has enemies, men who spend their lives looking for leverage. If someone finds out a random barista in Chicago knows the dead dialect of my family, they will take you. They will torture you to find out how you're connected to me. I'm not connected to you." Gemma snapped, her voice cracking. "I don't know anything about your family. I don't know anything about a fire. You looked at my file, I was a toddler wandering around a truck stop in Ohio. That's it. That's my whole story. And the lullaby." "I don't know," she almost shouted, the panic finally breaking through her stoic front. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. "I don't know. It's just noise. It's just a noise my brain makes when things get bad. It doesn't mean anything." Lorenzo shifted. He leaned across the wide leather expanse of the back seat. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was a physical weight. She could feel the heat radiating off his dark suit. "It means everything," Lorenzo murmured, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Because my mother died with that song in her throat. And 30 years later, you spit it out onto the floor of a train station. You are a ghost, Gemma, and I am going to figure out exactly whose grave you crawled out of." The Maybach didn't stop at a luxury hotel or a suburban mansion. It descended into the concrete bowels of a high-rise in the Gold Coast. The underground garage was vast, harshly lit and entirely empty, except for a row of black SUVs. Arthur opened the door. The damp, cold air of the concrete cavern hit Gemma's face. She grabbed her duffel bag before Arthur could reach for it, swinging the heavy strap over her shoulder. She wasn't going to let them strip her of the one thing she owned. Lorenzo walked ahead, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished concrete. He bypassed the main elevator bank and pressed his thumb against a biometric scanner next to a steel door. It hissed open, revealing a private wood-paneled car. Gemma stepped inside, pressing herself into the back corner. The doors slid shut and her stomach dropped as the elevator shot upward with terrifying speed. There were no buttons, just a smooth, unbroken ascent to the top of the skyline. When the doors opened, the silence was heavy and expensive. The penthouse was a sprawling expanse of white marble dark walnut and floor-to-ceiling glass. The city of Chicago sprawled below them, a grid of glittering gold and harsh red tail lights smeared by the driving rain. The sheer scale of the space made Gemma feel suffocated. It was a beautiful, sterile cage. Arthur put her in the east wing, Lorenzo said, unbuttoning his coat. He didn't look at Gemma. He walked toward a heavy oak door down the main hall, his posture tight, the exhaustion he'd been fighting all day, finally bleeding into the line of his shoulders. "Wait," Gemma said. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed by the massive room. Lorenzo paused his hand on the brass doorknob. He looked back over his shoulder. "Am I a prisoner?" she asked. The question tasted like copper. "You're an insurance policy," Lorenzo replied coldly. "Don't try to leave. The elevators require my print and the stairwell doors lock from the outside. If you break a window, you drop 40 stories. Get some sleep." He opened the door and disappeared into what looked like an office, shutting it firmly behind him. Arthur motioned down a long, dimly lit corridor. "This way." Gemma followed the massive man, her boots squeaking faintly on the marble. He opened a door at the end of the hall and stepped aside. The guest room was larger than the coffee shop she worked in. It had a king-sized bed with blindingly white sheets, a minimalist grey sofa, and a wall of glass looking out over the dark water of Lake Michigan. "Bathroom is through there. Kitchen is down the hall. Don't wander into the boss's side of the house," Arthur said. He pulled the door shut. Gemma listened to the heavy, solid click of the latch. She immediately dropped her bag and lunged for the handle. She twisted it. It didn't budge, locked from the outside. Her breath hitched. The walls, despite being mostly glass, suddenly felt like they were shrinking. She backed away from the door, her chest heaving. She was trapped in the sky, with a man who looked at her like she was a bomb, waiting to detonate. She forced herself to move. Standing still was how the panic won. She walked into the bathroom, a massive space of dark slate and chrome. She stripped off her damp clothes, leaving them in a pathetic heap on the heated floor, and turned on the shower. The water was scalding. She stood under the spray until her skin turned pink, trying to scrub the smell of wet wool, cheap coffee, and fear off her body. But as the steam filled the room, her mind betrayed her. Il lupo en el bosco. The words echoed in her skull. She squeezed her eyes shut, leaning her forehead against the cold, wet slate of the shower wall. Why that song she couldn't remember a mother. She couldn't remember a fire. Her earliest memory was the harsh, fluorescent lights of the Ohio truck, stop the smell of diesel, and a police officer offering her a stale donut. The Italian words were just a broken record that played in her head when she was terrified. Down the hall in the dark expanse of his office, Lorenzo wasn't sleeping. He sat in a leather armchair by the window, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting on his thigh. He hadn't turned on the lights. The only illumination came from the storm outside, flashing occasional jagged streaks of lightning across the sky. He took a slow drink. The scotch burned his throat, but it did nothing to numb the jagged ache in his chest. He had spent 30 years burying the ashes of Calabria. He had built an empire of concrete and blood in Chicago, ruthlessly exterminating anyone who threatened his territory. He was a man who dealt in absolute control. But the girl in the East Wing defied control. She was a paradox. Her background check was perfectly blank. She flinched like a beaten dog, but she stared back at him with a cynical, furious defiance that belonged on the streets, not in a coffee shop. And her voice. Lorenzo closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the heavy crystal glass. When she had whispered those words in the train station, the decades had collapsed. For one horrifying, paralyzing second, he wasn't the head of the outfit. He was 7 years old again, choking on thick black smoke, his mother's blood soaking into his knees as she hid him under the floorboards. He opened his eyes, the memory fading into the cold reality of his penthouse. He set the glass down on a side table. The ice clinked sharply in the quiet room. He didn't know who Gemma Hayes was, but he knew she was the key to a door he thought he had welded shut forever. And he would break her mind wide open if he had to, just to see what was buried inside. Harsh morning light sliced through the gaps in the motorized blinds, striking Gemma directly in the eyes. She flinched, burying her face into the heavy down pillow. It smelled like unscented bleach and expensive linen. For 3 disorienting seconds, she thought she was in a hotel. Then the heavy, oppressive silence of the penthouse rushed back in, pinning her to the mattress. She sat up violently. Her muscles screamed in protest, locked tight from spending the entire night curled into a defensive ball on top of the covers. She hadn't changed clothes. Her jeans were stiff with dried rainwater, and her cheap boots were still laced tight to her feet. Gemma swung her legs over the edge of the bed. Her stomach hollowed out, emitting a loud, painful rumble. She hadn't eaten since a stale bagel yesterday morning. Survival instinct, blunt and demanding, temporarily overrode her terror. She walked to the heavy oak door. She grabbed the brass handle, expecting the same solid, immovable resistance from last night. It turned smoothly. The latch clicked open. Gemma froze. The hallway beyond was dim, the floorboards gleaming like dark glass. She stepped out, her rubber soles squeaking faintly. The air was unnaturally still, regulated by a silent, invisible HVAC system. There were no sounds of traffic, no sirens, just the faint, rich aroma of roasted coffee and toasted bread. She followed the smell. The kitchen was a vast, open-concept expanse of white marble and brushed steel. Lorenzo stood by a massive island, his back to her. He wasn't wearing a suit today. He wore dark slacks and a black, heavy-knit sweater pushed up to his forearms. He was pouring boiling water from a matte black kettle over a ceramic dripper. The precise, methodical, circular motion of his wrist was mesmerizing. "Sit," he said. He didn't turn around. Gemma crossed her arms over her chest, digging her fingernails through the fabric of her damp shirt into her own skin. "I prefer to stand." Lorenzo finished the pour, set the kettle down with a soft click, and finally turned. His dark eyes swept over her wrinkled clothes, the dirt smudged on her cheek, and the defensive hunch of her shoulders. He picked up a plate, holding 2 thick slices of sourdough toast and a perfectly fried egg, walked around the island, and set it on the glass dining table. "Sit down and eat," he repeated. His voice wasn't raised, but it carried the immovable weight of a physical shove. "Starving yourself won't make me let you go." Gemma stared at the food. Her mouth watered so aggressively it actually hurt. She dropped into the leather chair, pulling the plate toward her. She didn't use the silver fork. She picked up the toast with her bare hands, tearing into it with an animalistic urgency. The crunch was loud in the silent room. She didn't care about manners. She cared about the calories hitting her bloodstream. Lorenzo sat across from her, holding a small ceramic cup of black coffee. He watched her eat with an unsettling clinical focus. "Do you know what 'ndrangheta' means?" he asked suddenly. Gemma swallowed a dry lump of bread. "Sounds like a mob thing. It's a Calabrian word. It means heroism or virtue," Lorenzo said, taking a slow sip. "It's also the name of the syndicate that controls the southern tip of Italy. My father was a boss. 30 years ago, a rival family, the Gallos, decided they wanted his shipping routes. They didn't just send hitmen. They sent a message. They locked the doors of our estate while we slept and poured gasoline through the vents." Gemma stopped chewing. The piece of toast in her hand suddenly felt like ash. "I was 7. Lorenzo continued, his voice devoid of any inflection. It was terrifyingly flat. "My mother hid me in a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. It was completely dark. The air got hot very fast. I could hear the beams collapsing above us. I could hear people screaming." He set his cup down. The ceramic clinked sharply. "And to keep me quiet, she sang that song, over and over, until the smoke ruined her vocal cords." Gemma pushed her plate away. Her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because—" Lorenzo leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass table. "You didn't just sing the lullaby. You used the exact phonetic inflection of a woman from a village of 300 people, a village that was entirely wiped off the map. You shouldn't exist, Gemma." "I told you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I don't remember. I was found in Ohio. The state gave me a name. Before that, my brain is just static. I don't have parents. I don't have a village." Lorenzo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object. He slid it across the glass table. It stopped inches from Gemma's hand. It was a tarnished, heavy gold ring. The face of it was heavily scarred, but she could make out the raised crest of a wolf. "Look at it," Lorenzo ordered softly. Gemma didn't want to. Her instinct screamed at her to throw it across the room, but her eyes dropped to the dull gold. A sharp physical pain spiked behind her left eye. The sterile kitchen vanished for a fraction of a second. She smelled wet earth. She smelled burning hair. She felt heavy, suffocating weight pressing down on her chest. A hand blistered and slick with sweat, pressing a piece of hard, cold metal into her small palm. "Hide it!" "Stai tranquillo, Passerotto." Gemma gasped, recoiling violently in her chair. The back leg scraped loudly against the floor. She clamped her hands over her ears, her breathing hitching into jagged, shallow pants. Lorenzo stood up instantly. He didn't look triumphant. He looked pale. He had seen the exact moment her eyes dilated the raw, unfiltered terror that had suddenly contorted her face. "You were there." He breathed the realization, hitting the air like a gunshot. Panic is not a quiet thing. It is a violent, ugly physical rebellion. Gemma scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the polished wood floor. She hit the edge of the kitchen counter hard enough to bruise her spine, but she barely felt it. Her lungs were pulling in air, but no oxygen seemed to reach her brain. The gold ring sat on the glass table, innocuously reflecting the morning light. To Gemma, it looked like a live grenade. "Don't!" Gemma choked out, holding her hand out defensively as Lorenzo took a step toward her. "Stay away from me." Lorenzo stopped. His face was a mask of rigid control, but the muscles in his jaw ticked furiously. He raised both hands, palms open, a gesture of surrender that felt entirely alien on a man built for violence. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice dropping to a low, rhythmic baritone. "Look at the floor. Ground yourself. 5 things you can see." Name them. Shut up, she hissed, her chest heaving. The smell of burning hair was still stuck in her sinuses. It was so strong she wanted to gag. You did this. You broke into my head. I showed you a piece of metal. Lorenzo shot back, the harshness returning to his tone. Your own brain did the rest. You were in Calabria. You were in that house. Before Gemma could scream at him, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse burst open. Arthur strode into the hallway. He didn't knock. He didn't announce himself. His massive frame moved with a terrifying silent speed, a suppressed pistol already drawn and resting against his thigh. Boss! Arthur barked his eyes, sweeping the room before locking onto Lorenzo. We have a problem. The concierge just called up. Vincent Gallo just walked into the lobby with 4 of his shooters. He bypassed the front desk and got onto the private lift. He'll be on this floor in 40 seconds. Lorenzo's posture changed instantly. The complex tense energy directed at Gemma vanished, replaced by a cold, mechanical lethality. He reached to the small of his back, pulling a compact Glock from his waistband and chambering a round in one fluid, practiced motion. He doesn't have the clearance for the private lift, Lorenzo said, his voice deadly quiet. He does if he bought the building manager. Arthur grunted, moving toward the front doors, taking up a tactical position behind a thick marble pillar. Lorenzo turned to Gemma. She was still pressed against the counter, her panic attack stalling out under the sudden influx of lethal, real-world adrenaline. Get up, Lorenzo ordered. Gemma's legs felt like lead. What is happening? The people who burned my family alive just walked into my building, Lorenzo said. He grabbed her upper arm. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness. He dragged her away from the kitchen, hauling her down the long, dim hallway toward his office. Wait. Gemma stumbled, her boots scuffing the floor. I don't belong here. Tell them I'm just a barista. Lorenzo shoved open the heavy oak door of his office. They don't care who you are. If you are breathing my air, you are leverage. And Vincent Gallo kills leverage. He pulled her behind his massive mahogany desk. He kicked away the expensive Persian rug, revealing a flush steel grate in the floorboards. He jammed his thumb onto a biometric pad hidden under the lip of the desk. A heavy hydraulic hiss echoed in the room, and a section of the floor smoothly slid open. A dark, narrow stairwell dropped into blackness. Go! Lorenzo shoved her toward the hole. Gemma looked down into the dark. Her throat closed entirely. The smell of the damp air rising from the hole was identical to the phantom smell from her flashback. Wet earth, confined space, a cellar. No, she sobbed, planting her feet, fighting his grip. No, please, don't put me in the dark. Please. Lorenzo hauled her back, grabbing both of her shoulders. He shook her once, hard enough to snap her teeth together. Look at me, he snarled. His dark eyes were burning mere inches from her face. If Gallo sees you, he puts a bullet in your kneecap to make me talk, and then he puts one in your skull when he's done. You get in the hole. You stay dead silent. Do you understand me? A heavy metallic thud echoed from the front of the penthouse. The elevator doors. Gemma squeezed her eyes shut, a tear leaking out, and cutting a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. She nodded. Lorenzo practically dropped her into the opening. She scrambled down the steep metal stairs, her shins scraping against the sharp diamond plate edges. The space was incredibly cramped, no bigger than a walk-in closet lined with concrete and steel. Above her, Lorenzo looked down one last time. His silhouette was entirely framed by the dim light of the office. I am locking the door, Lorenzo whispered into the dark. Ma noi siamo qui. He didn't wait for her to answer. The heavy steel plate slid shut above her, with a deafening final clank. Total absolute blackness swallowed her. Gemma fell back against the cold concrete wall, sliding down until her knees hit her chest. She wrapped her arms around her legs, burying her face into her knees. The air was cold, smelling faintly of cedar and gun oil. Above her, muffled by inches of steel, she heard the heavy, muffled shouts of men. Then, the terrifying, unmistakable pop of suppressed gunfire. Gemma pressed her hands over her ears, rocking slowly in the dark, and began to whisper the only thing that kept the monsters away. Vibrations traveled through the steel walls, rattling the marrow in Gemma's bones. It wasn't a cinematic gunfight above her. It was a brutal, chaotic demolition. She heard the sickening crack of heavy wood splintering, followed immediately by a wet, heavy thud that shook the dust from the concrete ceiling into her hair. The gunfire wasn't continuous. It came in sharp, deafening bursts, controlled lethal pops that punched through the acoustic barrier of the floorboards. Gemma curled tighter into a ball, pressing her palms against her ears until her jaw ached. It didn't block out the sound. It didn't block out the phantom smell of gasoline and char that was currently suffocating her. "Stai tranquillo, passerotto," she chanted, her voice a frantic, broken whisper in the pitch black. "Il lupo è nel bosco, ma noi siamo qui." The darkness in the tiny steel box was absolute, stripping away her sense of time and space. The claustrophobia was a physical weight, crushing her lungs. As she rocked back and forth on the freezing diamond plate floor, the 30-year wall in her brain finally violently shattered. She wasn't in Chicago anymore. She was incredibly small, her knees scraping against rough dirt. The heat was unbearable, blistering the skin on the back of her neck. Someone was dragging her by the wrist. A woman. The woman's face was obscured by thick, greasy black smoke, but her hands were covered in sticky, wet heat. Blood. The woman shoved her into a narrow, suffocating gap beneath a stone foundation, pressing a heavy, jagged piece of metal into her tiny palm. "Hide it. Stai tranquillo. The wolf is in the woods." The woman didn't climb in with her. She turned back toward the screaming and the roaring flames, leaving the little girl alone in the dark. Gemma gasped, choking on the stale air of the hidey hole, tears hot and fast, tracking through the dirt on her face. The memory didn't come with a name or a clear lineage. It just came with the absolute, soul-crushing certainty of abandonment. She had been left in the dark while the world burned. Directly above her head, a massive crash shook the steel plate. Someone screamed a high, wet sound of agony that was abruptly cut short by a final singular gunshot. Then silence. It was a heavy, dripping silence. Gemma stopped rocking. Her lungs seized. The silence meant the violence was over, but it didn't mean she was safe. It just meant a victor had been decided. Footsteps. Heavy, measured, leather-soled footsteps approaching the desk. Gemma scrambled backward, pressing her spine flat against the cold concrete. She dragged her knees to her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged. If the hatch opened and a stranger looked down, she had nowhere to run. She was trapped in a coffin. A mechanical whir echoed above. The heavy steel plate groaned and slowly slid back, dragging a blinding shaft of morning light into the hole. Gemma flinched, throwing her arms up to shield her face, letting out a raw, involuntary whimper. "Gemma!" The voice was a harsh, breathless rasp. She dropped her arms, blinking against the harsh glare. Lorenzo was leaning over the edge of the opening. He didn't look like the untouchable, sterile Mafia boss who had poured coffee 10 minutes ago. His black sweater was torn at the shoulder, exposing angry red skin. Blood was smeared across his jawline and dripping steadily from a deep laceration above his left eyebrow, spotting the pristine floorboards. His chest heaved with adrenaline. He didn't offer a gentle hand. He dropped down onto the first metal step, reaching into the dark, and grabbed her by the upper arms. He hauled her out of the hole with brute, desperate strength. Gemma's boots hit the floor of the office. She immediately stumbled, her legs completely numb from the panic and the cold. Lorenzo caught her before she hit the mahogany desk, pulling her hard against his chest. She fought him for a split second, a feral, terrified reaction. Her hands pushed against his shoulders, her fingers sliding on the damp, sticky blood soaking his sweater. He smelled of copper-burnt powder and pure violence. "Stop!" Lorenzo ordered, his voice cracking. He didn't let her go. He wrapped his arms around her back, locking her against him, burying his face into her messy, dusty hair. "Stop fighting. It's over." Gemma froze. The frantic rabbit-kick rhythm of her heart slammed against his ribs, and she realized his heart was pounding just as violently. The untouchable Lorenzo Vitti was shaking. She went entirely limp, sliding down an inch before his grip tightened, holding her up. She looked over his shoulder. The office was a slaughterhouse. The Persian rug was soaked in a spreading dark stain. 2 bodies lay near the doorway, limbs tangled at unnatural angles. Arthur was standing over a third, methodically wiping down a suppressed pistol with a clean cloth, completely unbothered by the carnage. "Don't look," Lorenzo commanded, roughly shifting his body to block her line of sight. He gripped the sides of her face. His hands were rough, trembling, slightly smearing his own blood onto her pale cheeks. His dark eyes were blown wide, stripped of all their usual cynical detachment. He looked at her as if she were a ghost that had finally materialized in the light. "You were in the crawl space," Lorenzo whispered, his thumbs pressing hard into her cheekbones. It wasn't a question. He had pieced it together from her panic, from the ring, from the impossible survival of a nameless girl. Under the south wing, when the roof collapsed. Gemma couldn't speak. Her throat was raw. She just nodded, a single jerky movement. "My mother put you there." He breathed the realization, hitting him like a physical blow. The absolute certainty of it settled into the harsh lines of his face. He leaned down, his forehead resting heavily against hers. "She saved the servants, kid." Gemma closed her eyes. The tears finally spilled over, mixing with the blood and dirt on her face. She didn't push him away. She gripped the fabric of his torn sweater, anchoring herself to the only other person on Earth who knew what the smoke smelled like. He wasn't a hero. He was a monster who had just massacred men in his own home. But as he held her in the ruins of his office, smelling of ash and survival, Gemma knew the terrifying truth. She wasn't a captive anymore. They were 2 feral, deeply damaged animals who had crawled out of the same fire, and Lorenzo was never going to let her go. Did your heart stop during that brutal final standoff? The collision of past trauma and present danger has officially bound Gemma and Lorenzo together. But in the Mafia world, surviving the fire is only the beginning. Will Gemma embrace the darkness of Lorenzo's empire, or will the ghosts of Calabria tear them apart? Drop a comment below with your theories on what happens next. If you loved this raw, pulse-pounding, dark romance, smash that like button, share it with your fellow Mafia drama addicts, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story.